Honourable Presiding Member, first of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the time to speak on this very important ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tourism and Foreign Employment. I think a lot of views were expressed regarding tourism and also foreign employment, so I would like to predominantly base my speech on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is one of the most valuable and important ministries, as it is the main institution that drives the foreign policy of a country. If you talk about the foreign policy of a state, that is also one of the most important policies, as it guides the country as to how it must interact with other states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, private parties, for achieving and managing the country's political, economic, defense, social and cultural interests. We know Greek philosopher Aristotle, he described humans as political beings. Therefore, friendships and relations across the seas and their use of foreign policy have existed between humans since the beginning of human interactions. So when we analyze the history of Sri Lanka's foreign policy since independence, we have seen how successive governments have taken various foreign policy stances and directions during Cold War era and post-Cold War era. Therefore, it has been very difficult for Sri Lanka as a country to maintain a neutral and friendly foreign policy, where all the time with all the countries they have maintained a friendly foreign policy, mainly due to the different internal political policies of the subsequent governments. If we briefly go down the memory lane, Sri Lanka's foreign policy, for example under Prime Minister D.S. Senanayake from 1948 to 1956, his relationship with the Western Bloc, he thought that was the only solution for economic growth in Sri Lanka. Then his successor, Sir John Kuthalawala, he signed the Rubberized Pact with Communist China in 1952, and this deal was done to settle the balance of payment crisis at the time. And in retaliation, we saw the US economic aid agreement never coming into operation. And subsequent governments, mainly S.W. Bandaranayaka's foreign policy, which was based on non-alignment and friendship with all countries. Then we saw Mrs. Bandaranayaka's policy. It was anti-capitalist and therefore anti-Western. Then we saw President J.R. Jayawardena. He continued to receive foreign assistance from the capitalist and communist countries as well as international organizations. So we saw countries such as UK and United States, Norway and Japan. They became the biggest donors of grants to Sri Lanka. And then again we saw President Premadasa, President Chandrika and also during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, we saw based on their political ideologies, the foreign policies changed and also their decisions to align with different countries also changed every 4 to 5 years. So basically in summary, if you look at the last 70 years, we saw that based on the political leadership of the subsequent governments, the foreign policies kept changing. So they were either extreme leftist or right-wing. So the country as a result suffered because every 4 to 5 years we saw certain governments align with some countries, whereas during another subsequent 4 years we saw them aligning with different countries. So now developed countries, for example, like United Kingdom, United States, Australia, they can afford to change their foreign policies. They can afford to align with different countries every 4 to 5 years because of their economic situation. We have seen countries such as China, Malaysia, Singapore, how they have achieved their global development through long-term, well-planned foreign policy. So if you look at examples like I've said earlier, China, Malaysia and Singapore, they had one long foreign policy. So irrespective of which government came into power, the foreign policy predominantly, I would say, 75% of their foreign policy did not change. So they left about 25% for that subsequent government to be flexible to put forward their favored parties. But predominantly, it was a long-term fixed foreign policy. So Sri Lanka, especially countries like Sri Lanka, developing nations, I think it would definitely benefit if we have a long-term foreign policy. So, Honourable Foreign Minister is also here today at the chamber. So I would request you to make that change, because for 70 years, like I said before, we have seen subsequent governments changing their foreign policy based on their political ideology. But I think you all have come to make a change in our country. So I would request you, humbly request you to consider having a long-term, maybe 10 to 15-year foreign policy which does not change based on the subsequent government. So if you look at the benefits of having such a long-term foreign policy, so many of the challenges faced by developing countries such as climate change, poverty and inequality are complex and require long-term coordinated efforts. So again, I would request the Honourable Minister to consider this.